Okay, it's my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jeff Burgess. Dr. Burgess has been collaborating with firefighters on health and safety research for close to 30 years, encompassing cancer, injury prevention, respiratory protection, and cardiovascular disease. Regarding firefighter cancer prevention, Dr. Burgess was the principal investigator of the FEMA grant application, Cancer Prevention in the Fire Service Exposure Assessment, Toxic Effects, and Risk Management, as well as the Firefighter Multi-Center Cancer Cohort Study, Framework Development and Testing, better known as our Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study. Dr. Burgess has worked as an emergency medicine physician, a medical toxicologist, and an occupational and environmental medicine physician. He is a member of the Fire Service Occupational Cancer Alliance, facilitated by the NFF. He previously served for 10 years as the co-chair of NIOSH on the National Occupational Research Agenda, that's NORA Public Safety Sector Council, where our firefighters are represented. In today's session, Dr. Burgess is going to be discussing our National Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study, also known as FFCCS. It is a multi-center prospective study of exposures, cancer prevention, and cancer outcomes in the fire service. It's a tremendous asset to us here in the United States. Dr. Burgess will be describing the FFCCS, the study results to date, and the ongoing research in there. Please join me in welcoming our senior scientist and a wonderful mentor, Dr. Jeff Burgess.
Thank you, Alberto. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with all of you today. And even though it's just my name up there, this is a really large group. This is a collaboration between the fire service, academia, government. It's been the most enjoyable thing that I've ever worked on. And it's because you get a chance to work with firefighters. That's enough said right there. I also would like to thank all the funders for this. This research would not happen without funding. FEMA has funded a lot of these projects. You can see all those EMWs there. This is not just mine, but it's all the other academics that have gotten grants as well. Also wanted to thank NIOSH, NIEHS, which is one of the National Institutes of Health, and the IFF has also funded part of this as well. So, I want to thank Derek Irwin from LA County. I borrowed a few of his slides. You'll see them later on, but they're good slides, so hopefully they're worth a second view as well. I'll be talking tomorrow. So just briefly, what is the Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study? As Alberto said, some important issues. One is that it's prospective, it's looking forward over time. Enormous opportunities for that as compared to the standard grants like, the Daniel study, which I'll talk about in just a moment, that was looking backwards over time. Also, collecting biological samples is really what distinguishes us from the National Firefighter Registry, and there's many things that we can do with that. These are all synergistic efforts. They're not competing. They all really feed into each other, and that's the way I really like to look at them. The other thing is, we have a very ambitious agenda, which is to look at 10,000 firefighters over 30 years. We're just starting off now. We have, I think, more like 1,500 plus another 200 volunteer firefighters. So around 1,700 now. We expect to be at 2,000 roughly in the next 6 months or so. And the other important point is not just understanding what the cancer risks are, but understanding how exposures lead to cancer. That's the mechanistic part. The other thing that's really unique about this, again, is the partnership. Firefighters are involved in every single part of this process, from telling us what questions to ask that are important for them so they can make changes for their own departments to protect their firefighters, to being part of the everyday research activities, the regular meetings. And we learn a lot from the firefighters. They learn a lot from us as we go through here. And then the firefighters are the ones deciding which interventions to put in place that we can test, because we're not just waiting for cancer. We want to prevent it. So what do we do in terms of outcomes that have come out so far? We have biomarkers that can measure both exposures and cancer risks. We want to, this is aspirational, develop individual cancer risk profiles to help guide firefighters early in their career. That's something that we'll develop during the 30 years of our project, but it's very high priority for us. We've already supported workers' comp claims. So as you heard Lori, we're talking about the expansion, the improvement of the cancer presumptive laws in the state of Arizona. The data that have come out of these studies have already helped support that. So we went ahead, Kepler was there too, a number of other folks here. We were presenting to our legislators the information to help support those improvements in our cancer presumptive laws. So again, we want to prevent cancer, not just study it, but prevent it, also eventually to identify it early and improve outcomes. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because I probably have more slides than I need. I'm a usual academic in that regard, but the Oversight and the Planning Board run by Casey Grant, this is really the way that fire service has input at the higher level. Realize that there's input for every single project we do too, with additional firefighters there. The Data Coordinating Center run by Alberto, fantastic. It is the one that creates all the surveys for us when we need them, tracks all of that survey data, maintains that regulatory work, which is an unsung part that takes forever for them. And so huge burden on that. They do it very effectively. The Exposure Assessment Center, Dr. Miriam Calkins from NIOSH, again, measuring the exposures using a variety of different techniques. And then I run the Biomarker Analysis Center, and we'll talk a little bit about how we use those biomarkers in a moment. I couldn't begin to tell you all the partners. It would take too much time, but just say that there's a lot of them. There's ones for our initial projects, and I didn't, and you can see that, that many are involved in more than one project as well, but we have a lot of different projects going around, and then they all work under the FFCCS umbrella. So this is a basic idea. I'm not going to, again, take too much time out of here, but you can see that the way we funded it, and again, a lot of this funding is from FEMA, is for very specific projects that have particular objectives. So we can do studies in different ways and answer different questions based on the funding, but again, it all contributes to the improvement of and prevention of firefighter cancer. So very busy slide. I won't, again, take everything in here, but at its root, what we want to do is prevention. So we can do that in a couple different ways. And just so you kind of interpret this slide, everything that's black are things we're already doing, potential future research topics that we already have kind of on the board or beginning to look at, those are in blue. So from a perspective, reducing exposures, again, we've already measured different ways of reducing exposures that, for example, with TFD, Tucson Fire Department, we want to get to this idea of treatment to help reverse some of the early changes. Again, that's something we hope to look at in the future. We already have some proposals to look at early detection of cancers as well. And I also want to point out, let me see if I can use this right here, that we're beginning to get into the reproductive field too. That's with our women firefighter study, from some work with male firefighters, with some colleagues of ours, Dr. Tim Jenkins from BYU, for example, working with LA County, wants to look at effects on sperm of firefighting. So again, things that will be coming up. I also want to point out here that we have, a way that we often do this is to compare new recruits to incumbent firefighters and then follow those new recruits over time. And again, we've seen here changes within the first between incumbents and new recruits, adjusting for things like age, where we've actually seen changes in these same markers over the first 2 years of a firefighter's career. So these are things well before the onset of cancer, but that express increased cancer risk. The other thing, as you've heard too, is we have a number of subgroups we've already looked at. We have one project on ethnicity, which was just kind of a side project. It's a much bigger, needs a much bigger effort. Alberto put in a proposal to FEMA. For that, I put in one for wildland firefighters beyond WUI. And in the past, we've had, again, other folks like Dr. Jenkins putting proposals in for reproductive outcomes. These are kind of some of the biomarkers in the middle. I'll get to that in the second slide, actually in a moment. But coming back to this NIOSH 3-city study, which is on the left, I wanted to use this not to go over it in detail, but just to point out the cancers that were up in that study as compared to another one in NIOSH, a case control study done by Rebecca Tsai and her colleagues. And if you'll notice, there are some that are the same and some in the boxes and some that are different. Why are there these regional differences? Again, as Lori had mentioned previously, this is really important. We don't know why. This is through the study, we want to be able to understand that by having multiple fire departments, involved in this and from different regions, not just a single location. The other thing that I'd like to bring up too is that within that California study, I like to point out that they also did a sub-analysis of minority firefighters, 2/3 Hispanic, 1/3 Black. They kind of analyzed them together because of the sample size, and they found an additional 6 cancers that were just up in the minority firefighters as compared to non-Hispanic white firefighters. Again, this is really important to do prevention. We need to know why that is. And then women firefighters, again, an understudied group, based on the Daniel study, and again, a lot of people don't focus on this part of it, the women firefighters there had a 10-fold or 1,000% increase in bladder cancer. So again, there'll be some similarities between women and men firefighters, but there are also going to be things that are different and unique. So how do we do this? As I told you before, one of the major things we do is collect biological samples. Why? Because we want to analyze biomarkers. A biomarker is just something that you can measure in biological samples. It could be the chemical itself you care about, a metabolite of that chemical, or some effect of that chemical on the body. Why are these particularly important for cancer? It's because of that long latency period between the exposure and onset of cancer. But depending on the type of cancer, it can be between 3 and 30 or more years. And so that biomarker is really looking at both the exposure and the cellular change. We generally look at exposure biomarkers in urine. We look at effect biomarkers generally in blood, although you can do each and that's not a hard and fast rule. And eventually we'd like to understand who's at higher risk using susceptibility biomarkers, but we haven't gone there yet. And again, we certainly involve our Oversight and Planning Board before we went that direction. So just some ideas of the things we currently evaluate, all the things on the left, both in blood and urine, both biomarkers of exposure, effect. There's even one that we're using right now that looks at ovarian reserve, the number of oocytes that are in a female firefighter. We have some preliminary information suggesting that this may drop at a more rapid rate in women firefighters than it does in women in the general population. Again, that's something we're working on. I also want to point, oops, good thing here we go. Wrong green button. So some of the things that are coming along too. So we've been really successful with these. Some of the things that we anticipate having, and I really believe this has huge promise, is being able to take a urine sample and be able to measure both the exposures that came out in the urine as well as the effects on the body. So this is a promising technology. It takes a lot to develop it, but by the end of 2021, we believe that we'll have some good ways of being able to look at chemicals that go up after a fire and the effects on the body. I think this is going to be incredibly important for both documentation of exposures and effects. Also, we're going to move beyond just the targeted PFAS that are generally measured, that are up in the general population, to be able to look at untargeted or additional PFAS that may be specific to firefighters as well. Again, this is through all of the colleagues that are working together on this. We talked before about sperm measurements. In the future, we'd like to be able to identify cancer early through cell-free DNA, small DNA particles that are coming off of cancers and floating in the body, and also some very cutting-edge technology to be able to look at mutagenic effects in firefighters in a very sensitive fashion in a way that's really never been possible before. So these are some of the things that we don't know the timeline specifically in it, but we're looking at being able to address this as well. So how does this work? Well, the way we work usually is either when we're putting in a grant proposal to FEMA or some other organization, or when we have funding and need additional partners, we talk with the fire department. It's important for the career departments to have both labor and management support of this. It's important to get volunteer fire departments as well too, and that's something that Dr. Judith Graber will be talking about, I believe, later in this session. And then we essentially go to the site. They decide where we should be recruiting people. It's completely voluntary. We collect blood and urine, collect survey information, and then we're really working now at reporting information back as soon as possible so that the participants of the study aren't just helping other firefighters, but getting information that's useful for themselves. So I want to highlight very quickly, and again, thanks to Derek Irwin from LA County, NIOSH funded a WUI study that went through the firefighter cancer cohort study framework, again, because it really facilitated the research. You don't want academics going out to actually sites of campaign fires. It's a bad idea. So the firefighters are out there collecting urine and bringing it back, and poor Sean Vital, who can raise his hand here just so everyone can see him, was driving around LA County, and you can imagine if you've been there what that was like, picking up the urine from the firefighters after they brought it back from the fire so we could get it back to our lab, so it could be sent to NIOSH in this particular case for analysis. So the firefighters, as you guys all know, are incredible problem solvers. So when you say, hey, we need to do this, he came up with, working with his team, with some solutions. We bought those black bags at Target and wrote on them, and they had them there so that, as soon as they came back from the fire, they'd pee in that before they, lost all their urine, and so that we could do our study. So interim results to date. And again, this is all through both the Tucson Fire Department, pre-study, and then the ones subsequently. We've shown that everyone on the fire ground is exposed, so not just the entry teams, but the engineers and the medics. We've also shown that interventions such as putting engineers on air and doing a wash down prior to doffing your gear reduces absorption of chemicals into the body of engineers and firefighters by about 40%. We've shown that use of wipes to clean skin not just reduces exposure, but it reduces the toxic response to those exposures. We've identified these epigenetic changes that put firefighters at increased cancer risk, both again between incumbent and new recruits over time. And we have some initial epigenetic changes that may explain why there's more those specific cancers in minority firefighters, and we have a lot of PFAS stuff coming. So how are these things being used? Well, TFD took this information, and again, it's a collaboration. They asked for this information, now they're using it to support their standard operating procedure changes to reduce their firefighters. We've used the results to help support the firefighter cancer presumptive laws, as you saw in Arizona that Lori was talking about. This information about mechanism was given to the folks that advise IARC, and it helped them decide to revisit firefighting again in June of next year. And this structure is helping us do all sorts of additional studies as we previously described. Just some very quick examples. What we did working with Jackie Goodrich at University of Michigan, who's an expert on DNA methylation, we found differences in Hispanic and non-Hispanic white firefighters in terms of methylation of genes, many of which are involved with cancer. We believe this may be one mechanism by which minority firefighters are having different cancers than non-Hispanic white firefighters. Again, a lot more research is needed. Also using the serum PFAS that we've measured. That previous one was published. This one is still kind of, it's in the process of being submitted, but we found that specific PFAS chemicals, PFHXS, straight chain PFOA, and branch chain PFOS are associated with epigenetic aging, so more rapid cellular aging. This is, again, one potential mechanism by which these exposures could cause cancer. And then finally, last steps. This one of the big things for us is to expand from this, what I believe to be will be around 2,000 soon, to 10,000 for this longer term. It is a challenge for us. It's something that we talked about in our meeting this morning. I think that we have a number of these other studies that are helping to support ways of looking at exposure, like the metabolomics, some potential for interventions to reduce exposure, so not just exposure reduction, as was done in Tucson, but perhaps some nutraceutical interventions as well, although again, these have to be done very carefully. And then we have additional studies for particular groups and particular exposures, like for example, concern about cell towers on stations, other sources of electromagnetic radiation. Our colleagues at University of Washington put in a proposal to FEMA to look at that using our same mechanism and our same endpoints. And again, happy to take any questions. So thank you for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. So this is our Q&A session, so we have a couple of minutes here. Any questions from the audience before I start entertaining those from the app online? And you'll have to stand up because these lights are glaring, so I can't see far out. Okay, so one of the questions that we have from our internet audience is saying, most of the data for exposures and studies collected are sort of like high-level acute exposures. Could you talk about the plans about how you evaluate low-level chronic exposures, say, from fluorinated materials?
Yeah, so Alberto and the person who asked the question was bringing up an important point of firefighters have kind of a unique exposure pattern of multiple repeat exposures on the fire ground. But in addition, they've got a number of other exposures that can occur from a number of sources. And so, you choose the location where you want to look at the exposure, for example, blood or urine, based on where that chemical is. So for a lot of the more chronic exposures that may build up in the blood, we analyze in the blood. So PFAS, brominated fire retardants, things that take a long time to get out of your body, we'll look at there.
With longer half-lives to stay there. All right, another question we have from our online audience is, if the data collected from a cohort is independent of the fire department, is it cross-referenced to a specific call to verify that the incident and the exposure actually occurred? There could be some pushback from the fire department if the data is sort of not validated.
All right, I'm trying to think about the question, but if I'm interpreting it correctly, we do try to collect information like Laurie was just presenting about, individual fire incidents. We collect information on that, but it depends. So if we're collecting urine after a particular incident, we do track that incident. If we're looking at some of these longer term effect, we look at all the exposures together. So for the epigenetic changes, we look at cumulative time at fire or the cumulative fire runs. So it all depends upon what we're trying to measure. But we do get information about specific fires if we're using those acute exposure measurements, like the WUI fire is a perfect example. We want to know exactly what was going on at that WUI fire so to interpret the urinary results.
Okay, so those were our questions online. Any others from the room? All right, well, join me in thanking Dr. Burgess for your presentation. All right, so we've reached our first break. So we've reached our first break for today. So we'll have a 25-minute break. It's 3 o'clock, so we'll regain the next portion of the symposium beginning at 3:25. So it's 3 p.m. We'll restart again at 3:25. We'll do some DVT prophylaxis. Please stand up, stretch your legs, socialize with everybody in the room. And for those of you online, talk to each other.